The moment Fannie Pritchard looked across that dusty Main Street and saw a man kneeling in the dirt to fix a child's broken wagon wheel with nothing but a rusted pocket knife and pure stubborn patience, she knew with a bone-deep certainty that Holly Greer's diamond ring meant absolutely nothing to her. Millhaven, Texas, in the spring of 1878 was the kind of town that smelled like ambition and horse sweat in equal measure. The cattle drives had been good to the region, and with good cattle drives came money, and with money came men like Holly Greer, who wore his wealth the way a peacock wore its feathers, loudly, deliberately, and with the firm conviction that everyone within eyesight ought to be impressed. His ranch, the Double G, sprawled across 11,000 acres northwest of town. He had 3 hired hands for every chore, a house with glass windows imported from St. Louis, and a reputation for getting precisely what he wanted before the ink was dry on whatever deal he was making. What Holly Greer wanted in the spring of 1878 was Fannie Pritchard. Fannie was 22 years old, the daughter of Robert Pritchard, who ran the general store on the east end of Millhaven's Main Street with quiet dignity and considerable debt. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had built herself a life out of early mornings and long evenings, helping her father stock shelves, keeping the ledger books, and occasionally delivering parcels to the farms and homesteads outside of town on the back of her brown mare, Ada. She was not the kind of woman who spent much time thinking about what men wanted from her. She was too busy thinking about what she wanted for herself. She had never been entirely sure what that was, if she was being honest. She knew she wanted more than ledger books and the smell of dried goods. She knew she wanted something that felt alive, something that moved in her chest the way the wind moved across the grasslands, without asking permission, without stopping to consider the consequences. She just hadn't met it yet. Holly Greer had come calling 3 weeks ago with flowers cut from his own greenhouse and a speech so practiced it barely sounded like language anymore. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a mustache that he trimmed with a small ivory comb he kept in his breast pocket. He wasn't an ugly man. He wasn't a cruel man, not openly. He was simply a man who had spent so long acquiring things that he had forgotten there was a difference between acquiring things and earning them. Her father had sat in his chair by the cold stove and said nothing, which was his way of saying everything. Her mother, Clara, had passed 2 years prior from a fever that had swept through the county with terrible efficiency, and Robert Pritchard had been quieter ever since, folded inward like a letter that had been read too many times. He wanted his daughter settled. He wanted her safe. Holly Greer represented both those things on paper, and Robert was a man who trusted paper. "You should give him fair consideration," her father had said the evening after Holly's first visit, watching Fannie put the flowers in a mason jar on the windowsill. "He's a good provider." "I know he is, Papa," she had said, not unkindly. "Your mother would have told you the same." "Mama would have told me to trust what I feel," Fannie said, "which is different." Her father had said nothing more, and she had gone to bed that night staring at the ceiling, listening to the coyotes call across the dark plain, wondering what it was she was actually waiting for. She found out 3 days later on a Tuesday morning in early April. She had been walking from the store to the post office to collect her father's mail, a task she did every Tuesday and Thursday, when she heard a small voice saying with considerable desperation that the wheel wouldn't come off, and the whole wagon was going to fall apart. She turned and saw a boy of perhaps 7 crouched over a wooden toy wagon in the dirt beside the trough outside the hardware store. One of the wheels had cracked along the axle and was listing sideways at an angle that promised total structural failure within the next 10 seconds. And then she saw the man. He had come around the corner of the hardware store at a loose-limbed, unhurried walk, the kind of walk that said he had somewhere to be, but he wasn't going to let the world rush him there. He was somewhere in his late 20s, lean in the way of men who did real work outdoors, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in perhaps 4 days and dark brown eyes that caught the morning light with something quiet and steady in them. His hat was a battered thing, creased and shaped by years of use, and his boots. Fannie noticed the boots because you always noticed a man's boots in Millhaven. His boots were worn at the toes and the heels, the leather cracked along the sides with the honest marks of a man who spent considerable time in the saddle and didn't trouble himself about appearances. He crouched down next to the boy without being asked, without making a production of it, and pulled a small knife from his vest pocket. "Let me see," he said to the boy, and his voice was low and unhurried, the same as his walk. "It's broke," the boy said miserably. "It's fixable," the man said. "Most things are." He worked for several minutes, using the knife to clean out the cracked axle housing, then reached into his other vest pocket and produced a short length of leather cord. He threaded it through the wheel's hub and around the axle in a way that Fannie couldn't quite follow from where she was standing, tightened it with a twist and a tuck, and then set the wagon down on the ground. The wheel held. "Try it," he said. The boy grabbed the handle and pulled, and the wagon rolled true and straight across the packed dirt. "It works," the boy said, and the joy in his voice was the uncomplicated, total joy that only children managed. The man smiled. It was a genuine smile, unhurried like everything else about him, and it changed his face in a way that Fannie felt somewhere in the region of her sternum. "There you go," he said, rising and dusting off the knees of his trousers. The boy pulled his wagon down the street, already absorbed in whatever mission the wagon was meant to serve, and the man watched him go for a moment before turning and very nearly walking directly into Fannie, who had stopped walking entirely without realizing it. He caught himself and stepped back, touching the brim of his worn hat. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said. "I didn't see you there." "It's entirely my fault," Fannie said. "I stopped walking." He glanced at her with a look that was curious but not forward, and she thought he was deciding whether or not to say something else. He decided not to, apparently, because he touched his hat again and stepped around her, continuing down the street at that same unhurried pace. Fannie stood in the middle of the road for a moment longer than was necessary, then collected herself and went to the post office, where she stood in line and thought about leather cord and worn boots, and the very simple, very thorough way a man could fix something broken without making any kind of noise about it. He asked Thomas at the post office, with what she hoped was a casual tone, if he knew who the man was who'd been over by the hardware store. Thomas squinted. "Lean fella, dark hat." "Yes. That's Benjamin Ashford," Thomas said. "He rides for the Callaway spread, been there about 2 years now. Good hand from what I hear. Quiet type." "I see," Fannie said. "Not a man of great means," Thomas added, in the way of small-town postmasters who considered it their civic duty to offer complete information. "But decent enough." "Why?" "No reason," Fannie said, and took her mail and went home. Benjamin Ashford. She turned the name over in her mind on the walk back, and decided it sounded like exactly what it was, a plain, honest name for a plain, honest man. She saw him again that same Friday at the dry goods auction that old Chester Bray held every few weeks behind his barn. Half the county turned out for those auctions, because Chester always managed to find something interesting among whatever lots he'd acquired, and the socialization was as much the draw as the merchandise. Fannie went with her father, who had a standing interest in any dry goods that might supplement his store inventory. Hollis Greer was there too, naturally, because Hollis was at everything in the county that was worth being at. He found Fannie within 5 minutes and attached himself to her side with the comfortable persistence of a man who considered the matter already settled. "Miss Pritchard," he said, tipping his hat, a good hat, dark and perfectly shaped, nothing like that battered thing Benjamin Ashford wore. "You look lovely this morning." "Thank you, Mr. Greer," she said. "I was hoping we might have a private word later in the day," he said. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." She knew what he meant. She had known for 2 weeks what he meant. Hollis Greer wanted to ask for her hand, and the whole county knew it, which meant the whole county was watching with the particular hungry attention that small communities reserved for anyone whose romantic life they could discuss at supper. "Of course," she said, because she didn't know yet what else to say. She spotted Benjamin Ashford 20 minutes into the auction. He was standing near the back of the small crowd with two other cowboys she vaguely recognized as Callaway hands, watching the proceedings with that same quality of quiet attention she'd noticed before. He wasn't bidding on anything. He had a cup of Chester's bitter coffee in one hand and was watching the crowd with eyes that moved slowly and took in everything without seeming to. Their eyes met entirely by accident when she turned her head to look at a lot of rope that her father was interested in. Benjamin's gaze had simply happened to be moving in the same direction at the same moment. He didn't look away immediately, the way a man who was trying to be careful about appearances might. He just held her look for a moment with the same unhurried steadiness that seemed to characterize every other thing he did, and then his eyes moved on. She felt color come to her cheeks and was grateful for the April sun that gave her complexion an excuse. Later, when the auction was winding down and her father was deep in conversation with Chester about bulk pricing on coffee beans, Holly's Greer appeared at her elbow with 2 tin cups of lemonade and the expression of a man about to execute a plan he'd been preparing for some time. "Walk with me a moment," he asked. She walked with him to the far side of Chester's barn, where it was quieter, and he handed her the lemonade and looked at her with an expression that she supposed he believed was romantic. "Miss Pritchard," he began, and then corrected himself. "Fannie. I think you know my intentions by now, and I believe in speaking plainly. I would very much like you to consider becoming my wife. I can offer you every comfort, a fine house, security for your father in his later years." He paused, as if consulting the speech he'd prepared. "I have great respect for you. I believe we would suit very well." He did not say he loved her. She noticed that immediately, the way you noticed the absence of a sound you'd been waiting to hear. "Mr. Greer," she said carefully, "I'm genuinely honored. I want you to know that I understand what you're offering and I don't take it lightly." "But," he said, there was a tightness around his eyes. "I haven't given you my answer yet," she said. "I'm asking for time." He studied her for a moment with the eyes of a man who was not accustomed to being made to wait. "How much time?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He pressed his lips together. "I won't wait forever," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been a warning, though he kept it dressed as a statement of fact. "A man in my position has there are other considerations. I wouldn't want you to mistake patience for unlimited availability." She looked at him and thought, clearly and completely, that she would never marry this man, not because he was without value, not because he had said anything unforgivable, but because he had just told her, without meaning to, that his feelings for her existed somewhere behind his feelings about his own position, and she did not think she could live in a house where she came second to a man's sense of himself. "I understand," she said. "I'll give you my answer soon." She walked back to her father, and the first thing she saw when she rounded the corner of the barn was Benjamin Ashford, who was loading a small lot of fence supplies into the back of a wagon, his hat pushed back on his head, working with that quiet economy of movement she had now noticed enough times to consider it a permanent feature of the man. He glanced up as she passed, and she nodded at him because she was raised to acknowledge people. He nodded back. "Good afternoon, ma'am." "Good afternoon," she said. And that was all, and it was somehow more satisfying than 20 minutes of Holly's Greer's practiced courtship. The opportunity she had not dared to hope for came in the form of a thrown horseshoe on a Wednesday afternoon 10 days later. Fannie had been riding Ada out to the Hendricks homestead 3 miles east of town to deliver a package of seeds and a bolt of cloth that Mary Hendricks had special ordered. It was a fine day, the kind that Texas produced in late April like an apology for the brutal summer it was already planning. Wide blue sky, the smell of new grass, mockingbirds going half insane in the cedar breaks. She had been in no particular hurry and had let Ada walk, enjoying the sun on her shoulders. She had seen him from about a quarter-mile away, a lone rider on a gray horse that was standing stock-still on the road with its head down in that particular miserable way of a horse that had hurt itself. The rider was off the horse, crouched down at the near foreleg, and even at that distance she could tell from the set of his shoulders that it wasn't good news. She nudged Ada forward and pulled up alongside the horse and rider, and found herself looking down at Benjamin Ashford, who was examining his horse's left front hoof with a focused expression. "Thrown shoe," he said, without looking up, "and she's gone tender. I don't want to ride her to town on this ground." "I'm headed back to Millhaven after the Hendricks place," Fannie said. "I could tell someone at Calloway's to send a man with a replacement mount." He looked up at her then, and she saw recognition shift through his eyes. He remembered her from the hardware store and from Chester's auction, she could tell. He also seemed to be running a quick internal calculation about whether accepting help was necessary or too much trouble, and deciding that necessity outweighed pride. "I'd appreciate that," he said. "Tell Jake Tully at the bunkhouse. He'll know what to do." He paused. "Tell him it's Ashford and it's the gray mare Celeste." "Ashford and the gray mare Celeste," Fannie repeated. "I've got it." She made to ride on, then stopped. "Are you all right out here? It'll be 2-3 hours before anyone can get to you." "I've got water and I've got shade in about 100 yards, he said, nodding toward a cluster of live oaks off the road. "I'll be fine." She thought of something. "I've got an extra biscuit in my saddlebag," she said, which was true. She always brought more food than she needed because her father had raised her with the belief that extra food was never a problem. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between amusement and surprise. "That's very kind of you, Miss Pritchard," she said. "Fannie Pritchard." "Benjamin Ashford," he said, and then added with a slight quirk of his mouth, "though I suspect you might already know that." She felt the color in her cheeks again, and was grateful he was looking back at the horse's hoof. "Thomas at the post office mentioned your name," she said, which was absolutely true and absolutely insufficient as an explanation, but it was what she had. She fished the biscuit out of her saddlebag, and he accepted it with a gravity that suggested he understood an offering when he was given one. She rode on to the Hendricks place, delivered her packages, had a cup of Mary Hendricks's very good coffee, and then rode back to Millhaven at a slightly faster pace than usual to get to the Calloway Spreads bunkhouse and deliver his message before it got late. Jake Tully, a weathered man of about 50 who smelled of tobacco and horse liniment, received her information with a nod and was already moving toward the stable before she'd finished the second sentence. "Good woman," he said to her, retreating back, which she took as a compliment. 3 days after that, she was sweeping the porch of the general store in the morning cool when Benjamin Ashford appeared at the end of the street, riding Celeste freshly shod and moving sound, and he rode past the store and then slowed, as if changing his mind about something, and turned the horse back. He pulled up at the porch and looked at her with that steady, unhurried look. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for getting word to Tully. It was kind." "It was nothing," she said. "It wasn't nothing," he said, with a simple directness that wasn't argumentative but just accurate. "I was out there for 3 hours, but I wasn't uncomfortable and Celeste got seen to. That was because of you." She stopped sweeping. "Then you're welcome," she said. He turned his hat in his hands, which she noticed because it was the first gesture she'd seen from him that looked anything less than settled. "Your father runs this store," he said. "I'll be in need of some supplies next week. Would that be all right to come by?" "It's a store," she said. "You're welcome to come by any time." Something shifted in his expression, that same almost smile she had seen when the boy's wagon rolled straight. "Thursday, then," he said. "In the afternoon." "Thursday afternoon," she agreed. He rode on, and she stood holding her broom in the April sunshine, and for the first time in quite a while, Thursday felt like something to look forward to. He came on Thursday as promised, with a short list of supplies written on a folded piece of paper in a neat, careful hand. He needed salt, a length of waxed cord, 2 good needles, a pound of dried beans, and a small amount of tobacco. though he clarified with slight self-consciousness that the tobacco was for Jake Tully and not for himself. She filled his order and they talked, first about small, practical things. The quality of the bean crop coming out of the eastern farms, whether Chester Bray was likely to get more of those good quality blankets in before summer. And then about less practical things, the way conversations do when two people are genuinely curious about each other. She learned that he was 27 years old, originally from a small farm in Missouri, and that he had come west 4 years ago after his family's farm had failed in the aftermath of a hard winter and a harder creditor. He spoke of it without self-pity, simply as a fact, the same way you stated that summer was hot or that the river ran south. He had worked his way through Kansas and the territories before landing at the Cowboy spread, which he seemed to find acceptable if not spectacular. "Do you like it here?" she asked, measuring out his beans. "In Millhaven." He thought about it genuinely, not reaching for an easy answer. "I like the country," he said. "The range is good, the work is honest." "Those aren't quite the same as liking the place," she observed. He looked at her with something that might have been appreciation for the distinction. "No," he said, "they're not." She told him about growing up in Millhaven, about helping her father with the store from the time she was old enough to reach the counter, about her mother, who had made the best dried apple pie in the county, and who had also made a habit of quoting scripture at inconvenient moments. She wasn't sure why she told him about her mother. She didn't usually talk about Clara Pritchard to people she hadn't known for at least a year. But there was something about the quality of Benjamin Ashford's attention that made her want to fill it with honest things. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "She sounds like a woman who knew her own mind." "She was," Fannie said. "She drove my father absolutely crazy sometimes, and he loved her completely. I think those things were related." He smiled, the full smile this time, the one that changed his face. "Probably," he said. He paid for his supplies and thanked her and left, and she watched him go from the window, and her father came up behind her with the ledger book and said without preamble, "That's the Callaway hand." "Yes," she said. "Hollis Greer has been asking after your answer," her father said, not unkindly. "He spoke to me yesterday." She turned from the window. "Papa, I don't love Hollis Greer." Her father set the ledger on the counter. His face was tired in that way it had been since her mother died, a permanent underlying tiredness that the ordinary light of a day could only partially conceal. "Fannie," he said, "a man like Greer, the stability, I know what he offers," she said. "I know what it would mean for you for the store. I know all of it, Papa, and I'm sorry, but I can't." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with the particular honesty of a man who has decided to say the true thing instead of the useful thing, "Your mother turned down a wealthy farmer to marry me. I had $30 and a good name at the time. She said that was enough." He paused. "I worried about it for the first 2 years. Then I stopped worrying." She crossed the store and hugged him, and he held her for a moment with his rough, work-hardened hands, and then stepped back and opened the ledger. "I'll tell Greer you've made your decision," he said. "Let me tell him," she said. "I'll do it properly." She found Hollis Greer the following Saturday at the social gathering that the Millhaven Ladies' Society held every month in the church hall. It was a broad community event, the kind where children chased each other through the legs of the adults and someone always brought too many pies, and the fiddle player. This month, a young man named Cal Denny kept the dancing going longer than anyone's feet preferred. Fannie had not particularly wanted to come, but she understood that you didn't send a message like the one she was carrying by way of a letter or a third party. You said it to a person's face because that was what was owed. Hollis found her before she found him, which was typical. He moved toward her with the certainty of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to go, and she held his gaze steadily as he approached. "Miss Pritchard," he said. "I trust this means you've had time to consider." "I have," she said. "Can we step outside for a moment?" They went to the small porch at the side of the church hall, where the sounds of the fiddle and the laughter inside came through the wooden walls muffled and warm. There was a half-moon up, the kind of moon that made the grassland silver for a quarter mile in every direction. "I've given your proposal a great deal of thought," she said, "and I want you to know that I've done so honestly because you deserve an honest answer." "And," he said, and his jaw had gone slightly tight. "I can't accept," she said. "I'm sorry." He was silent for a moment, and she watched the different things that crossed his face, the surprise that wasn't entirely surprise, the wounded pride that was larger than the actual wound underneath it, the particular expression of a man who is trying to decide whether to argue or accept. "Is there someone else?" he asked. She considered lying because it would have been simpler, but she'd promised herself an honest answer and she'd deliver one. "Not in the way you mean," she said. "There's no other arrangement or promise. But I don't feel for you what a woman ought to feel for the man she's going to marry, and I don't think you'd be satisfied with less than that, no matter what either of us might say now." He studied her for a long time. "The Calloway hand," he said, and it wasn't a question. She didn't answer because she didn't know yet what the answer was, and she wasn't going to speculate about Benjamin Ashford to Holly's Greer in a churchyard at 9:30 on a Saturday night. "I see," Greer said, with a coldness that had been carefully manufactured into a kind of dignity. "Then I wish you well, Miss Pritchard." He went back inside, and she stood on the porch listening to the fiddle and the laughter for a while longer, looking out at the silver grass, and felt something in her chest that was not relief exactly, but was related to it, the feeling of a decision made cleanly, without leaving anything undone. The thing she had not anticipated was that Holly's Greer was not a man who took rejection without doing something with it. Within a week, the story was all over Millhaven. She had turned down the richest man in the county. That was the phrase that went from door to door like a piece of gossip determined to outrun a healthy horse. She turned down Holly's Greer, with his 11,000 acres and his glass windows from St. Louis, and she turned him down for a cowboy with worn boots who worked a hired hand's wage on someone else's spread. The speculation about her sanity was considerable, and not always conducted in particularly kind terms. Margaret Holly's, no relation to Greer, just an unfortunate sharing of names, told 3 separate women at the dry goods counter on 2 separate days that poor Robert Pritchard must be mortified. The circuit preacher made a general comment on Sunday about the wisdom of practical decisions in practical times, which everyone understood to be directed at Fannie even though he never said her name, and she sat in the pew and listened to it with her hands folded and her chin level. Her father, to his enormous credit, said nothing except that the preacher could mind his own affairs. What Fannie had not quite anticipated was how this conversation would reach Benjamin Ashford, and what he would do when it did. She found out on the Thursday after the church social, when he did not come for supplies at the time he'd said he might, and instead did not come at all. She tried not to notice this. She was largely unsuccessful. On the following Monday, she was delivering a parcel to the widow Carver on the south side of town when she came around a corner and found herself face to face with Benjamin Ashford, who was coming in the opposite direction and looked, for the first time in her experience of him, like a man who was not quite sure of his footing. "Miss Pritchard," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said. They were both still for a moment, and the parcel was in her hands and the street was warm and empty around them. "I heard what people are saying," he said, "about Greer, about you choosing a cowboy with worn boots." He stopped. "I want you to know that I don't have any interest in being the subject of a piece of gossip, and if the story people are telling has made things uncomfortable for you, I'm sorry for that." She stared at him. "You're apologizing to me for gossip you didn't start. I just don't want you to think," he began, and she could see him working through something uncomfortable. "I don't have any right to presume about what you want or what you've decided or—" "Benjamin," she said, and his name in her mouth surprised them both, the familiar shortness of it, the way it landed between them without ceremony. "I didn't turn down Holly's Greer because of gossip. I turned him down because I don't love him, and I won't marry a man I don't love simply because he has good acreage and glass windows." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a brave thing to say in a town like this one," he said. "It's just the true thing," she said. "I've noticed that you have a habit of saying the true thing, too." Something moved through his eyes. "I try to," he said. "Then maybe you'd like to take a walk with me on Sunday afternoon," she said, "and we could say some more true things to each other and see what that amounts to." The silence between her words and his answer was not long, but it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight, the weight of a decision being made clearly and with full understanding of what it means. "I'd like that," he said. She nodded once, with the satisfaction of a woman who has said precisely what she meant. "Sunday, then," she said, and walked on to deliver her parcel. They walked on Sunday along the creek that ran behind the south end of town, where the cottonwoods made a broken canopy of new green against the sky, and the water was running high and quick from the spring rains. Fannie wore her good gray dress with the small flowers at the collar, and Benjamin had made some attempt at tidying himself. His shirt was clean and his jaw was freshly shaved, but the boots were the same, worn at the toes and cracked at the sides, and she found she liked looking at them because they were honest. They talked for 2 hours. Not the careful, measured talk of a first meeting between strangers, but the kind of conversation that goes where it goes because both people are genuinely interested and have given up trying to manage where they're headed. She told him about the year her mother was sick, the long months of watching Clara Pritchard diminish by careful degrees, and the very particular grief of losing someone you'd spoken to every day of your life. He told her about his mother in Missouri, still alive, in the care of his younger sister after their father had passed, and the way he sent money back every month from his wages because you didn't stop being a son just because you'd put 1,200 miles between yourself and your people. She asked him how he'd learned to fix things the way he had, the wagon, the fence post she'd heard Jake Tully mention once in passing, the way he could mend a saddle as well as the saddle maker, and had apparently also fixed the Callaway kitchen stovepipe last winter in the middle of a norther. He shrugged, but it was a genuine shrug, not a dismissive one. "My father wasn't a man who could afford to buy new things," he said. "So he learned to fix everything, and he taught me the same. The trick is to look at the thing that's broken until you understand why it broke, and then you know how to fix it so it doesn't break the same way twice." She thought about that. "That's good philosophy for more than just stovepipes," she said. "I suppose it is," he said, and looked at her with that quality of attention she had come to understand as his particular way of being interested in someone. Near the end of the walk, when they had come back around to where the creek bent close to the edge of town, she stopped and turned to look at him directly. "I want to be honest with you," she said, "because I think that's the only way this is worth anything. I like you. I find that I have liked you since I watched you fix that little boy's wagon wheel without being asked, and without making anything of it. I don't know yet what that means or where it goes. But I'd like to find out if you're willing." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something careful and also something completely unguarded in his eyes, as if he had given up managing his expression and decided to let her see what was actually there. "I'm willing," he said. "I've been willing since you handed me a biscuit in the road." She laughed, and the laugh was real and sudden, and his face broke into that full smile that changed everything about it. They stood there in the cottonwood shade with the creek running behind them and the afternoon sun coming down at a long angle through the trees, and it was not a kiss, not yet, and it was not a declaration, not in so many words, but it was the beginning of something that both of them understood with absolute clarity. What followed were the best 6 weeks of Fannie Pritchard's 22 years. Benjamin came to the store on Thursdays with his list, and stayed to talk until her father gave him a look that communicated, politely but firmly, that the store still had to be run. He came to the Sunday walks every week, and they ranged farther each time down the creek to the Cottonwood Flat, out toward the low hills where the wildflowers were coming up in the good April rain, once all the way to the edge of the Callaway property, where a particularly fine stand of bluebonnets had come up in an old field, and they sat in the flowers for an entire afternoon and said many things, and some of them were important, and some of them were not, and all of them mattered. She brought food because she always brought food, and he always tried to say that wasn't necessary, and she always replied that necessity had nothing to do with it. He told her about the ranching life with an honesty that didn't prettify anything. The early cold starts and the late hot finishes, the way cattle could be both beautiful and utterly maddening, the particular loneliness of a bunkhouse full of men who mostly didn't say much about themselves. She told him about the bookkeeping and the ordering and the occasionally ridiculous customers, including one regular who insisted that the beans she stocked were not the correct shade of brown and came in every other week to complain about it. "What shade does he want?" Benjamin asked, entirely seriously. "He doesn't appear to know," she said. "I think the complaining is the point." "Some people," Benjamin said with great philosophical weight, "are like that." She went to Calloway's spread twice during those weeks, once with her father on store business, and once on her own with a message for Jake Tully about an order he'd placed. The second time, she arrived at the time when the day hands were finishing their work and coming in from the range, and she sat on the fence near the stable and watched them come in, the whole long movement of horses and men through the late afternoon light, and she found Benjamin among them easily because he was the one she was looking for. He saw her on the fence, and she saw the moment he registered her there, the slight adjustment in his posture, the way his horse picked up its pace without being cued, as if the animal was responding to something in him. He rode over to her and stepped down from the saddle, and they talked for half an hour while he unsaddled Celeste and brushed her down, the comfortable talk of two people who have gotten past the careful part and arrived at the easy part. And she thought this was what her mother must have meant, the thing her mother had tried to communicate in all those small ways over all those years. That love was supposed to feel like the most natural thing in the world, like something you had always been walking toward without knowing its name. She rode home that evening with Ada at a long, relaxed walk, and the setting sun painting the whole country in colors that seemed excessive even for Texas, and she thought about her life and what she wanted it to be and found, with a quiet certainty that felt nothing like the anxious wondering she'd done before, that she knew. She knew what she wanted. She was already walking toward it. The complications, when they came, arrived in the form of Hollis Greer's particular brand of influence. 2 weeks after Fannie and Benjamin had begun their Sundays together, Stuart Calloway, the owner of the spread where Benjamin worked, received a visit from Hollis Greer. This was not unusual on its face. Greer did business with Calloway and most of the other ranchers in the county. His reach was broad and commercial and unavoidable. But this visit, by what reached Fannie through the reliable channel of Jake Tully via Thomas at the post office, was somewhat different in character. Greer had, apparently, expressed some general interest in acquiring the Calloway outfit's northern grazing lease, a very valuable piece of land, and had mentioned in the same conversation, entirely as an aside, that he understood one of Calloway's hands had been spending considerable time in town pursuing a social connection that some in the county found questionable given the circumstances. He had not said Benjamin's name. He had not said anything that could be directly held against him. But Stuart Calloway was a man who understood the mathematics of land leases and the mathematics of Hollis Greer's displeasure, and he had called Benjamin into the house that same evening and had a conversation. Benjamin told her about it the following Thursday, standing at the counter in the store with his supply list folded in his hand, and the telling was quiet and factual in the way he told most things, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "Calloway didn't fire me," he said. "He's not that kind of man, but he made it clear that he'd appreciate it if I kept a lower profile." His words. "I see," Fannie said, and the anger she felt was clean and cold and very useful. "I want you to know," Benjamin said, "that I haven't done anything different and I don't intend to. Calloway can make his requests, and I'll respect the man's position, but I'm not going to stop coming to the store on Thursdays or walking with you on Sundays because Hollis Greer has decided to make himself an inconvenience." She looked at him. "He could make real trouble for you," she said. "For your position, I know," he said. "I'd rather have real trouble and a clear conscience than an easy life that I can't respect." She was quiet for a moment because the thing he had said had hit somewhere deep in her, the exact same shape as something she had already believed but never quite heard said aloud. "This isn't fair to you," she said. "You've done nothing wrong." "The world isn't particularly interested in what's fair," he said, and there was no bitterness in it, just the calm statement of a man who has made his peace with that fact. "I've found it's better to decide what you're going to do regardless of whether it's fair and go from there." She reached across the counter and covered his hand with hers, which was a significant gesture in a store in the middle of the morning in a small Texas town in 1878, and she held his gaze while she did it. "Thank you," she said, "for not being moved by him." He turned his hand under hers and held it for a moment, and the warmth of it went straight up her arm. The next Sunday they walked farther than usual, out to a stretch of open range where the grass was high and the sky was enormous, and there was nothing in any direction but land and light and the sound of the wind. They sat on a flat limestone outcrop that the locals called the shelf, and Fannie spread out the food she'd brought: biscuits, cold chicken, sliced apple, 2 small bottles of the local sarsaparilla that she'd been fond of since childhood, and Benjamin took off his hat and set it beside him, and tilted his face up to the sky with his eyes closed for a moment, as if he was taking inventory of everything good in that particular moment and filing it away. She watched him do this and thought she had never seen anything so unguardedly peaceful on a person's face. "Benjamin," she said. He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I love you," she said. Because it was the true thing and she had promised herself true things. The silence was 3 seconds long, and in those 3 seconds she held everything very still inside herself. "I love you too," he said, and the simplicity of it was its power, the way he said it like a statement of fact that he had been sure of for some time and was simply now confirming aloud. She smiled, and felt the smile all the way to her heels. He reached out and tucked a strand of wind-blown hair behind her ear, his rough hand gentle against her face, and then he kissed her, there on the shelf in the open country with the sky enormous above them, and it was a kiss that felt like the answer to a question she had been asking her whole life without knowing how to phrase it. When they pulled apart, he kept his forehead against hers for a moment, and his eyes were dark and warm, and she thought she knew that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I should like to speak to your father," he said quietly. "He'll say yes," she said. "He knows." "Does he?" Benjamin said with a slight smile. "He noticed I stopped being restless," she said. "He connected the two things. My father is smarter about feelings than he pretends to be." He laughed, soft and warm, and she heard it as a sound she wanted to hear for the rest of her life. He did speak to her father, the following Thursday, and Robert Pritchard looked at this man with the worn boots and the careful hands and the direct, honest eyes, and he asked him 2 questions: whether he had any existing obligations that he hadn't mentioned, and whether he intended to provide for Fannie with everything he had, and not just with everything he had on good days. Benjamin answered no to the first and yes to the second, with the uncomplicated certainty of a man who had thought about it before being asked. Robert Pritchard shook his hand and said he would be glad to call him son. Fannie, who had been listening from the back room with absolutely no shame about it whatsoever, pressed her hand to her mouth and felt tears on her cheeks that she was not remotely embarrassed by. The matter of Hollis Greer was not finished, however, because men like Hollis Greer were not accustomed to finishing gracefully. In the week after Robert Pritchard gave his blessing, word spread, as all word spread in Millhaven with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, that Fannie Pritchard was to marry Benjamin Ashford, the cowboy from the Callaway spread. The reactions were varied. Some people were warm, genuinely pleased for her, offering congratulations with the uncomplicated happiness of neighbors who liked her and wished her well. Some were cautious, reserved in the way of people who did not quite understand a choice they would not have made themselves. And some, a small but vocal few, took the position that she had made a catastrophic error and made sure this position was known. But the development that truly mattered was the one that arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of Stuart Calloway appearing in the general store. Stuart Calloway was a round, florid man of 55 who had made his ranch work through shrewd management and a fundamental dislike of complications. He came into the store with his hat in his hands and a look that said he was doing something he was not fully comfortable with, which Fannie respected for its honesty, even if she was wary of what it signaled. "Miss Pritchard," he said, "I want to speak plain with you if you'll allow it." "Please," she said. He turned his hat around in his hands. "I've had another conversation with Greer," he said. "He's made me a formal offer on the northern lease. It's a good offer. He stopped. He's attached a condition." She kept her face still. "What condition?" "He says he'll withdraw the offer, and what's more, he'll make a competing bid on a piece of land I've been planning to acquire to expand my east pasture if." Calloway paused again. "If Ashford is still in my employ." The silence in the store was complete. Her father had come from the back room without her noticing and was standing in the doorway, and he was very still. Fannie looked at Calloway for a long moment. "He wants you to fire Benjamin," she said. "He didn't use the word fire," Calloway said, with the careful phrasing of a man who wanted the distinction on record. "He said certain personnel changes would be viewed favorably. But yes, that's what he means." "And what are you going to do?" she asked. Calloway met her eyes, and she saw in them the genuine conflict of a man between his business interests and something else that was pulling on him with less material but no less real force. "I don't like being put in this position," he said. "I want that on record, too. Ashford is a good hand and a decent man, and he's done nothing to deserve this. But you came here instead of simply telling him," she said. "Why?" Calloway was quiet for a moment. "Because I thought you should know," he said finally, "and because I wanted to see if there was another way. Ashford said he won't stop his courtship on Greer's account, which I respect, even if it complicates my situation considerably. And I find I'm not entirely comfortable." He pressed his lips together. "I find I am not comfortable doing Greer's business for him in this particular way." Fannie took a breath. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "how long has Benjamin worked for you?" 2 years and some months, Calloway said. "And in that time has he given you any reason for complaint?" "None," Calloway said. "None at all." "Then I'd ask you to remember that," she said, "and to consider what kind of man you want to be doing business with and what that says about the kind of business you want to run." Calloway stared at her, and there was a moment where she genuinely could not tell what he was going to do. Then he let out a long breath through his nose and put his hat back on. "I'll be speaking to Greer this afternoon," he said. "I'm going to decline his offer." "I appreciate that," she said. "It's going to cost me," Calloway said. "I want you to understand that I know that." "I know you do," she said, "and so does Benjamin, and I don't think either of you will find it was the wrong decision." Calloway nodded once and left. Her father came out of the doorway and stood beside her at the counter, and they were both quiet for a moment. "That man has some backbone after all," her father said. "He does," Fannie agreed. "Greer did make the competing bid on Calloway's east pasture land. He also made a point of being somewhat cool to her father's store, sending his ranch business to a supplier in the next town for several months. This cost Robert Pritchard a notable amount of income, and Fannie watched her father absorb this with the steady, uncomplaining patience of a man who has decided where his loyalties lie and accepted the cost. She helped him compensate by redesigning the store's ordering system and expanding their coffee and spice inventory, which drew customers from the neighboring farms who had previously relied on less convenient suppliers. It was slow and deliberate, and her father said nothing about it being because of Greer, but they both knew, and the knowledge sat between them like a shared debt paid forward. Benjamin heard about the Calloway meeting from Jake Tully the same day it happened. He came to the store that evening after closing, and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and looked at Fannie with an expression she had never seen on him before, not quite undone, but close to it. "You shouldn't have had to handle that," he said. "I didn't handle it," she said. "Calloway handled it. I just said what I thought." "Fannie, Benjamin," she stepped closer to him. "Stop trying to feel responsible for Hollis Greer's behavior. You are not responsible for what he does. You are only responsible for what you do." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him processing this with his characteristic thoroughness. "I know that," he said finally. "I just don't like that any of this has touched you or your father." "It's touched us very lightly compared to what it could have been," she said. "And we'll be fine. Papa is already expanding the coffee inventory." "He seems almost pleased about it." Something softened in his face. "Is that so?" "He likes having a project," she said. "He's been needing one." He reached out and pulled her to him, and she rested her head against his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart, and his arms came around her, and the evening was warm and the main street of Millhaven was quiet around them, and it was the most comfortable place she had ever been. "Marry me soon," he said, into her hair. "I don't want to wait any longer than we have to." "I thought you'd already asked me," she said. "I asked your father," he said. "I'm asking you." She lifted her head and looked at him. In the last of the evening light, with his hat in one hand and his other arm around her, and those worn boots on the porch boards and everything about him steady and honest and entirely present, she thought he was the most extraordinary person she had ever seen. "Yes," she said. "Soon. Let's do it soon." They were married on the first Saturday of June 1878, in the same church where the circuit preacher had made his pointed comments about practical decisions, which Fannie found satisfying in a way she didn't bother to conceal. The ceremony was simple and genuine, the way they had both wanted. Her father walked her down the aisle with his shoulders squared and his eyes bright, and he shook Benjamin's hand at the altar with the firm, decisive grip of a man making a permanent transaction with great satisfaction. Jake Tully served as Benjamin's witness, having apparently agreed to this role weeks earlier, and having obtained a new suit jacket for the occasion that he wore with the air of a man enduring something itchy for a good cause. Fannie wore her mother's dress, which Clara Pritchard had worn for her own wedding 26 years earlier, and which Fannie had spent 3 evenings altering to fit her properly. It was a deep cream color with small pearl buttons at the wrists, and it smelled faintly still of the dried lavender her mother had kept in the chest. When she walked in and saw Benjamin standing at the front of the church, she saw his expression change, the pure, unguarded reaction of a man seeing something that has gone past his ability to manage his face, and she treasured that. She would treasure it her whole life, that look. When the preacher said the words and they made their promises, Benjamin said his with a direct simplicity that was purely him, and when he said, "I do," it was the most certain sound she had ever heard. They settled into a small house on the north edge of Millhaven that Benjamin had secured through an arrangement with a farmer named Dawson, who owed a debt to Stuart Calloway and worked it off in part through a fair rent to Calloway's best hand. It was not large, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a sleeping porch, but it was solid and it was theirs, and Fannie approached the making of a home with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything. She kept a kitchen garden and sold excess produce to supplement Benjamin's wages. She continued to help her father at the store 3 days a week, which she genuinely loved and had no intention of stopping. Benjamin was offered, within his first month as a married man, a promoted position at the Calloway spread unofficial foreman of the North Range crew, which carried a modest additional wage and a great deal of additional responsibility, which he accepted with characteristic equanimity. Hollis Greer, as it happened, made one more attempt at consequence. In the late summer of that year, he acquired the majority interest in a land tract to the south of Millhaven, and announced intentions to develop it commercially in a way that would have drawn significant trade away from the town center, which would have affected all of the main street businesses including the Pritchard store. The county commissioners, who were mostly practical men with their own interests in mind, initially looked favorably on the proposal. What stopped it was not a dramatic confrontation, but rather the quiet collective response of a community that had, by then, made up its mind about the kind of place it wanted to be. A number of the ranchers and business owners, led most vocally by Stuart Calloway, petitioned the commissioners against the development on grounds of impact to established businesses and the town's already limited water access. The petition was long and detailed, and contained a great deal of very specific information about water rights and property lines and existing commercial agreements, some of which had been very carefully compiled by Fannie Pritchard, who had always been very good with ledger books, and had found that the same skill applied quite well to legal documentation. The development was declined. Hollis Greer moved his primary residence to a town 20 miles east the following spring, citing better access to rail shipping, and the county, while it did not exactly breathe a collective sigh of relief, did settle back into itself with a quality of ease that had been slightly missing for a while. Fannie heard this news from Thomas at the post office on a Thursday and went home and told Benjamin, who was sitting on the sleeping porch mending a section of leather harness with the focused patience he brought to all acts of repair. "He's gone," she said. He looked up. "Good," he said. She sat down beside him. "Is that all you have to say?" He considered. "I hope he finds whatever it is he's looking for," he said with complete sincerity. "I don't think he's a happy man." She thought about this. "No," she said, "I don't think he is." "He got what he wanted," Benjamin said, pulling a stitch through the leather. "He just never figured out what he needed." She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched him work, and thought about what he'd said, and found nothing to add to it. The first year of their marriage passed the way good years did, not without difficulty, because no years were without difficulty, but with a quality of shared navigation that made the difficulties feel manageable and sometimes even interesting. The summer brought a drought that stressed the range and required 2 weeks of emergency water hauling that left Benjamin exhausted in a way she hadn't seen before, and she made him rest on a Sunday, and made the very good apple pie that her mother had taught her, and they sat on the porch with the pie and the cooling evening, and talked about what they would do if the drought continued, and then talked about other things, and then sat in comfortable silence until the stars were fully out. The autumn brought better rain, and the range recovered, and the Calloway herd had a good calf crop, and Benjamin came home in October with a small amount of bonus wages and the look of a man who had done his work well and knew it. He set the money on the table and said, "I've been thinking." She sat down across from him. "Tell me." "I've been thinking about a piece of land," he said. "Dawson's East parcel, 40 acres. It's not the richest ground in the county, but it has water rights, and with the right work," he stopped. "I've been talking to Calloway about it. He'd let me buy it through a payment arrangement set against my wages over a few years. It's not a sure thing. It's a risk." She looked at the money on the table and then at her husband. "Tell me about the water rights," she said. He looked at her, and the thing that moved through his eyes was not surprise exactly, but something warmer than surprise. "There's a creek on the south edge that runs 9 months out of 12, he said. "And the land is good for a kitchen farm if it's worked right, and cattle," she asked. 30 head on that acreage if managed carefully," he said. "Then let's do it," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "It'll take years," he said, "building it up. It won't be Benjamin," she said. "I know how to build something from the ground up. I've been doing it my whole life." She squeezed his hand. "Tell Calloway yes." They signed the agreement with Stuart Calloway in early November, and the 40 acres on the east of Dawson's parcel became the beginning of something they called the Ashford place, first in conversation, and then officially when they registered the deed. In the winter of 1879, Fannie knew she was expecting. She told Benjamin on a cold December morning when the frost was still on the sleeping porch boards and the light was thin and silver, and he went very still for a moment in the way that she had learned meant he was processing something large. Then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, carefully, as if she had suddenly become precious in a new and specific way that required adjustment. "Good?" she asked into his shoulder. "The best possible thing," he said, in a voice that wasn't quite steady. She pulled back and looked at his face and saw what was there: pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind that had nothing self-conscious in it, and she felt it move through her like the warmth of the good stove, all the way to the edges of herself. Her father, when he was told, sat down in his chair by the cold stove and was silent for a moment, and then said, with a directness that was the most honest thing she had heard from him in years, "Your mother would have been so happy. I'm so happy." And his voice broke slightly on the last word, which was fine because she was already crying. The baby was born in August of 1879, in the heat of the Texas summer, attended by the midwife Delamie Carson, who had brought half the county into the world and was calm and capable and entirely unimpressed by drama, which Fannie found deeply comforting. It was a boy. They named him Robert James Ashford, Robert for her father, James because it had been Benjamin's father's name, a quiet acknowledgement of both the families that had made them, the thread of continuity that ran through time regardless of how far you traveled from where you'd started. Benjamin held his son for the first time with the same careful thoroughness he brought to everything he valued, completely, with full attention, both hands, as if he was memorizing the weight and warmth of the child. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked, and Fannie watched him from where she lay and thought she had never seen love so plainly on a person's face. "Hello," Benjamin said to the baby, in a voice so low it was almost nothing. "I'm your father." Robert, who would become Bobby almost immediately and remain so for the rest of his childhood, regarded his father with the vague, unfocused intensity of all new persons, and then apparently decided he had seen enough and went asleep. "He has your nose," Fannie said. "He has your expression," Benjamin replied. "Like he's already figured something out and isn't telling anyone." She laughed, and it hurt a little, and she laughed anyway. The Ashford place grew. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way honest things grew, steadily, incrementally, with setbacks absorbed and adjustments made and the good years accepted with gratitude, and the hard years worked through with patience. By 1881, Benjamin had added 12 cattle to the land he'd already broken for a small working operation. By 1882, with Fannie's kitchen farm producing significantly enough to be worth noting, they had paid off the second installment of the Cowboy arrangement and were ahead of schedule on the third. He still worked at the Cowboy spread, because the wages were reliable and the relationship was good, but less of his time was borrowed and more of it was invested in the Ashford place, and the balance was shifting in the right direction. The community, which had watched all of this with the keen and generally well-meaning attention of a small town with limited entertainment options, came around to a settled appreciation for the Ashfords. The gossip about Fannie's choices had long since been replaced by the observable reality of a woman who ran her household and her quarter of her father's store and her kitchen farm with admirable competence, and a man who was known to be reliable and honest, and who had proved several times over that worn boots were not a reliable measure of a man's worth. Holly's Greer, from his new location 20 miles east, did not trouble them again. Occasionally his name came up in the usual commerce of county news. He'd acquired a new parcel. He'd built a new structure. He remained the richest man in that part of Texas, and Fannie received these updates with the mild, uninvested interest with which she received news about weather patterns she wouldn't have to live through. Robert Pritchard, her father, recovered himself in those years in a way that Fannie found quietly beautiful to watch. The store's expanded inventory had done what she'd hoped: brought in new customers, stabilized the income, and given him work to organize his energy around. He spent several evenings a week at the Ashford place, eating supper with his daughter and son-in-law and his grandson, who by the age of 2 had developed a specific attachment to his grandfather that manifested primarily as following the man around the house and periodically sitting on his feet. "He's going to be a good boy," Robert told Fannie one evening, watching Bobby systematically investigate the contents of the kitchen basket. "He's going to be a lot of trouble," Fannie said affectionately. "Same thing," her father said. In the spring of 1883, on an afternoon when the bluebonnets were up in the east field the way they had been the first year she and Benjamin had walked out there, Fannie sat on the steps of the Ashford house with her husband beside her and her son on the ground in front of them, pursuing his ongoing project of moving dirt from one place to another for reasons that satisfied only him. And she thought about how full the quiet was. Not empty full, not the heavy full of something that had nowhere to go. The full of a life that had been deliberately constructed out of the things that actually mattered, in the company of people who were genuinely known to each other. "I want to tell you something," she said. He turned to look at her unhurried. "Another baby," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the same thing happen that had happened the first time, the stillness, and then the warmth, the uncomplicated joy that had no performance in it. "When?" he said. "November, Delamy thinks," she said. "Maybe early December." He took her hand and turned it over, the way he did when he was holding something he wanted to be careful with, and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Two," he said, with a quality of wonder that was entirely unself-conscious. "Two," she confirmed. "Maybe more eventually." He looked at her. "Is that what you want?" "I want whatever we build," she said honestly. "I want a full house and a working piece of land and a man I trust completely, and I have all three. Whatever else comes is good fortune." He kept her hand in his and looked out at the east field where the bluebonnets were running blue and purple against the grass, and his thumb moved in slow circles against her palm. "I used to wonder," he said quietly, "what I was working toward before I came here. I'd put in a day's work, and it was honest work, and I could take some satisfaction in that. But at the end of the day, there was nothing that was mine. Nothing that was going to be there the next morning because I'd built it." She listened. "And now," he said, and the word contained everything, the house, the land, the boy moving dirt, her hand in his, all of it. "I can't imagine not knowing." She leaned her shoulder against his. "Neither can I," she said. They sat in the April afternoon, and the sun moved the shadows of the cottonwoods slowly across the yard, and Bobby found something particularly interesting in the dirt, and announced it with incoherent but passionate commentary. And the cattle were somewhere in the east field beyond the bluebonnets, and somewhere down the road her father was in his store adding numbers in the ledger book, and getting them right. And the world was exactly what it was, imperfect and unreliable and occasionally hostile. The way worlds were. And inside all of that, in this particular yard on this particular afternoon, everything that mattered was present and accounted for. The November baby came on schedule in the first week, before the real cold had settled. It was another boy, wide awake and emphatic about his opinions from the very first minute, and they named him James William Ashford. William for no one in particular, except that it sounded right beside James, balanced. Jake Tully, who had become a fixture at the Ashford supper table with a frequency that suggested a man filling a loneliness he didn't advertise, held the new baby with the extreme careful concentration of a man who had never been responsible for anything quite so small, and was taking the responsibility very seriously indeed. "He's louder than Bobby was," Jake observed. "He's making his position known," Benjamin said. "What position?" Jake asked. "That he's here," Fannie said from where she was resting, "and that the world should adjust accordingly." Jake looked at the baby with something like respectful consideration. "I can respect that," he said. Bobby, age 3.5, was initially uncertain about the addition of a brother, and expressed this uncertainty by sitting as close to his mother as physically possible for approximately 2 weeks. Then James grabbed his finger on a Tuesday morning and refused to let go, and Bobby's expression went through several rapid and complete changes before arriving at something that looked very much like belonging. And from that point forward, the question of brotherhood was settled. The Ashford place grew further. By 1884, the cattle count was at 30, the number Benjamin had originally projected on that 40 acres. achieved 5 years in and ahead of the optimistic schedule he'd set for himself. Fannie had turned the kitchen farm into a working market garden that supplied the general store, which her father now managed with a hired assistant, freeing Fannie from the 3 days-a-week commitment to a consulting relationship that she found she enjoyed more, both because it gave her the distance to see the operation clearly, and because it meant she could disagree with her father's supply decisions with the authority of an expert rather than an employee. The year 1884 also brought the completion of the final installment of the Callaway arrangement, which meant the Ashford land was theirs outright, clear and documented and unencumbered, and Benjamin held the deed in both hands at the kitchen table for a long moment before setting it down and saying, with a simplicity that was the truest form he had for his deepest feelings, "We did that." "We did," Fannie agreed. "The boots," he said with a slight smile. He was wearing a newer pair now. She'd bought them for Christmas the previous year, good strong leather with solid heels. But the old ones were in the back of the wardrobe, and she had no intention of ever throwing them out. Jake Tully told me once when I first came to Callaway's that a man's boots tell you what kind of man he is. Says a man with bad boots either doesn't care about his standing or doesn't have the means to care about it, and either way, people won't take him seriously. Jake Tully was wrong, she said. He was, Benjamin agreed. Though he's come around. She stood up and went to the wardrobe and retrieved the old boots, setting them on the table between them. He looked at them. The leather was cracked all the way around the sides now, the soles worn through in 2 places, the heels nearly flat. They had been carefully cleaned, though, even in retirement, she had done that quietly on the occasional evening when she felt like handling something that deserved to be handled with care. "When I saw you kneeling in the street with those boots," she said, "fixing that little boy's wagon, I thought, there is a man who does the right thing without needing anyone to see him do it. I didn't know your name. I didn't know anything about you, but I knew that." He looked at her across the table, across the old boots and the deed and the lamp between them. "And everything else," she said, "has just been the confirmation." He got up from his chair, and she came around the table, and he held her for a long time in the kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the boys asleep in the back room, and the November dark pressed close against the windows. And outside the Ashford land was 30 good acres under the stars, every inch of it earned and true. The following years carried them forward with the compound interest of a life well and deliberately lived. Bobby grew into a serious-minded, observant boy who had his father's patience with broken things, and his mother's particular gift for seeing past the surface of a situation to its actual structure. By the time he was 7, he was doing small repairs around the farm under his father's instruction, and by 9, he was helping with the cattle in the early mornings before school in a way that suggested genuine aptitude. James, the louder and more emphatic of the two, was his mother's child in the matter of clear expression. He said what he meant, sometimes before he had fully thought through the diplomatic dimensions, and Fannie regarded this trait in him with the complex appreciation of a woman who knew exactly where he got it. He was generous and fierce in the way of people who felt things strongly and acted on those feelings directly, and she thought, when she watched him, that the world would find him bracing company. Robert Pritchard retired from active store management in 1886, handing the operation to his hired assistant under Fannie's continued oversight, and moved into the smaller back room of the Ashford house, which Benjamin had extended over one winter specifically to accommodate this possibility. He lived there with the quiet dignity of a man who had received more than he had expected from life, and was grateful for it, spending his evenings on the sleeping porch with one or both grandchildren in various states of activity around him. On an evening in October of that year, Robert Pritchard sat with Fannie on the porch while the boys were inside being put to bed by their father, and he looked out at the Ashford land in the last of the evening light and said, after a silence that had been comfortable for its entire length, "I was wrong to push you toward Greer." "Papa," she said. "Let me finish," he said. "I was scared. I thought comfort and stability were the same as happiness. Your mother knew the difference, and I knew she knew it, and I still nearly pushed you toward the wrong choice out of fear. I've been meaning to say that for a while." She reached over and took his hand. "You didn't push me," she said. "You nudged, I nudged back, and then you let me go." "Because you were right," he said. "We were both right about what we wanted for me," she said. "We just had different ideas about how to get there." He squeezed her hand. "He's a good man," he said. "Ashford, a genuinely good man." "He is," she said. "He really is." Inside, she could hear Benjamin's voice, low and steady, telling the boys something, a story probably, the nightly story that had become a fixture of the household routine, invented fresh each time from the materials of the day's events, cattle and creek water, and the particular behavior of a hawk that had been observed from the east field that morning. Bobby contributed plot details, and James contributed sound effects, and Benjamin wove them all together with the same patient, thorough craft he brought to everything he made. She sat on the porch with her father's hand in hers and listened to the sound of her house, full and warm and running over with the life that had been built in it, and thought about a Tuesday morning in April 1878, and a man kneeling in the dust with a pocket knife, and a length of leather cord and worn boots, and the purest quality of simple, unhurried goodness she had ever seen. She thought about the ring she had not accepted, the glass windows she had not wanted, the 11,000 acres that had meant nothing to her measured against 40 honest acres, and a man who said the true thing. She thought about standing in the middle of the road, holding nothing, waiting for something she couldn't name, and the way it had arrived, not with fanfare or presentation, but with a crouching, quiet man and a small boy's wagon rolling straight and true across the packed dirt. She thought, "I always knew what I needed. I just needed to see it." The stars came up over the Ashford land one at a time, the way they always did, the way they always would, and the sound of the nightly story drifted out through the open window, and her father's hand was warm in hers, and the October air smelled of dry grass and coming cold and the wood smoke of 100 homes, and the boots in the back of the wardrobe were there, still cleaned, still kept, still the most honest pair of shoes she had ever seen in her life. In the spring of 1887, on the anniversary of their wedding, Benjamin woke early before any light and was sitting on the sleeping porch with his coffee when she found him, and she wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and sat beside him in the cool pre-dawn dark. "Thinking?" she asked. "Remembering," he said, "that Sunday walk, that first one, when you said the true thing." "Which one?" she said. "I said several. The one where you said you'd like me since the wagon," he said. "And that you didn't know where it would go, but you wanted to find out." She leaned into him. And I want to tell you something I should have said sooner," he said. "That I think the bravest thing I ever saw was you standing in that middle of that road in your life with Greer and the whole county and your father's store and all of it, and knowing exactly what you didn't want and trusting yourself enough to say so." She was quiet for a moment. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean. You were afraid and you did it anyway, and it changed everything. It changed my life, Fannie. It made my life." The words settled into her with a warmth that was bigger than the blanket, bigger than the coffee, bigger than the coming light that was just now beginning to show itself as a pale gray edge along the eastern horizon. "You made your life," she said. "You made it before you ever met me. I just happened to be on the road when you were going past." "Lucky road," he said. She laughed, and he pulled her closer, and they sat and watched the dawn come up over the Ashford land, the good 40 acres that ran to the creek and beyond, the small herd in the east field just becoming visible in the new light, the garden she had planted that would come up again in a month, the house behind them full of sleeping people she loved with her whole and complete and entirely decided heart. The sun came up gold and enormous over the Texas plain, the way it always did, without apology and without modesty, and the mockingbirds started in the cedar breaks, and the cattle moved, and the creek caught the light, and all of it was exactly and precisely and permanently theirs. Robert Pritchard lived another 4 good years in the back room of the Ashford house. Years of grandchildren and sleeping porch evenings, and a genuine contentment that Fannie considered the most important thing she had ever helped provide for another person. He passed in the winter of 1891, quietly in his sleep, the way the kindest endings came, and the whole of Millhaven turned out for his funeral because he had been a man who dealt fairly and worked honestly, and those things were remembered. They buried him next to Clara Pritchard in the church cemetery, and Fannie stood at the graveside with Benjamin's hand in hers and Bobby on one side of her and James on the other. And she thought about the man who had sat in his chair by the cold stove and said your mother would have told you the same, and who had then, in his better moment, told her the truer thing, that her mother had turned down a wealthy farmer for a man with $30 and a good name, and that it had been enough. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. In the years that came after, the Ashford place continued to grow and to be what it was, a working place, a lived-in place, a place that accumulated the layers of a life being genuinely inhabited rather than merely maintained. A third child, a daughter they named Clara after her grandmother, arrived in 1893 to the enormous enthusiasm of her brothers and the quiet joy of her parents, and she came into the world as a small and definite person with her father's steady brown eyes and her mother's jaw, and she regarded the world from her first days with the expression of someone who had already decided to be interested in it. Bobby became a horseman of considerable local reputation, inheriting from his father a particular quality of communication with animals that went beyond technique into something less definable, more felt. He broke horses for several of the county's ranchers while he was still in his teens, and people paid him for it, which he accepted with the same uncomplicated matter-of-factness as his father accepted wages. James, true to himself, became a talker, a connector, a man who knew everyone in Millhaven and beyond and who was known in return, and who in his 20th year began writing a small regular column for the county newspaper about agricultural matters and land law and the general business of frontier life, because the frontier was changing and someone should be paying attention and writing it down. The frontier was changing. By the 1890s, Millhaven had grown from the town Fannie had grown up in into something larger and less personal, with railroad access and new businesses, and the steady displacement of the old rough character of the place by something more organized and less adventurous. She watched this happen with the layered feeling of a woman who loved what the place had been and understood that change was not a question of preference. But the Ashford land remained the Ashford land. The 40 acres, added to over the years by 2 small adjacent parcels acquired through careful saving and careful timing, had become a working spread of genuine substance. Not the 11,000 acres of the Double G, not the scale of any of the large county outfits, but real land, producing land, land that fed people, and employed 2 hands and was registered in the county record as belonging clearly and completely to Benjamin and Fannie Ashford of Millhaven, Texas. She kept the store going until the mid-1890s, when she finally handed it fully to the manager who had been running it for years and who knew the inventory as well as she did and better than her father ever had. She folded that chapter with the satisfaction of a woman who had done a job completely and could now redirect her attention. In the spring of 1895, on a morning that had everything April had to offer in the way of sky and light, and the particular Texas green that came once a year and stayed for exactly as long as it intended, Fannie went out to the east field to check on the bluebonnets, which came up every year in the same place they always had, as faithful as any promise. She heard his boots behind her on the dry grass, that particular step she would have known in a crowd of 1,000 people, and he came up beside her and stood looking at the field of flowers. "Still here," he said. "Every year," she said. He was 44 years old now, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into the Texas sun, and he was as lean and unhurried as he had ever been, and she loved him with the settled, total love of someone who had chosen well and known it from the beginning and had been proven right by every single day that followed. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time we sat here? You brought food," he said. "You always brought food." "I brought sarsaparilla," she said. "I hadn't yet made up my mind about anything else." "Yes, you had," he said, with the certainty of hindsight. "You'd made up your mind on that Tuesday morning by the hardware store, you just hadn't admitted it to yourself yet." She considered this. "That might be true," she allowed. He took her hand, and they stood in the bluebonnets in the April sun, and the cattle were somewhere to the north of them, and the house was behind them with Clara in it helping the housekeeper with the morning bread, and Bobby was in the lower pasture with 2 of his horses, and James was somewhere writing something down, and the world was full and accounted for. "I'm happy," she said, not as a discovery because she had known it for years, but as a statement offered to the morning, to the flowers, to him. "So am I," he said. He lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, right there in the field in the daylight with the birds going and the wind moving the bluebonnets in long, slow waves around them. And she felt it all the way through, the warmth of it, the permanence of it, the clean and total rightness of a life built out of the things that were actually true. She thought about a young woman standing in the middle of a road wondering what she was waiting for, and she thought, "I know now. I was waiting for this." Not for the destination, but for all of it, the road itself, the choosing, the learning what was worth keeping and what was not, the wagon fixed in the dust, the biscuit in the road, the leather cord and the honest work, and the worn-down boots that told the truth about a man better than all of Holly's Greer's glass windows ever could. She had turned down the richest man in the county, and she had chosen this, and she had been right, and the rightness of it had compounded year upon year upon year until it was a thing of such substance and such warmth that she could not imagine, standing in the bluebonnets with her husband's hand in hers and the April sun on her face and her life full and good around her, that she had ever feared the choice. She had not been afraid of choosing wrong. She had only been afraid of choosing small, and she had not. She had chosen large enough for everything that mattered, for every true thing, for the full weight of a life lived in the direction of what was real. She squeezed his hand and he looked at her. "Let's go in," she said. "I promised Clara I'd teach her to make Mama's pie this morning." "The apple pie," he said. "The very one," she said. He smiled, the full smile, the one that changed his face, the one she had first seen on a man kneeling in the dust of a Texas street with a pocket knife and a length of leather cord, making something broken whole again with no audience and no reward but the thing itself. She would see that smile for the rest of her life, across tables and fields and sleeping porches, and all the ordinary mornings of a life that was extraordinary simply because it was genuinely theirs. They walked back to the house together through the bluebonnets, and the April morning held them in its good, unhurried light, and the door opened, and inside there was warmth and flower and the sound of a young girl singing something tuneless and cheerful to herself, and everything was exactly as it was meant to be. The Ashford place stood. The boots stayed in the wardrobe, cleaned and kept, the most honest pair of shoes in the county, belonging to the man who had built his life the way he fixed everything, by understanding why things broke and making them whole in a way that held.